Right, so yes, thanks everybody for coming along. What we're going to try and do over the next 45 minutes or so we're going to aim to get the some slides done in about 45 minutes that give us a bit of time at the end for some questions. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at BREEAM and in particular the sort of changes and the implications to those changes that there have been in the current version, which is 2018, kind of over and above the previous 2014 version. So this is kind of BREEAM New Construction. If you've not come across us before, I did one for you know, through the same sort of route before on Part L and the upcoming changes to Part L and the Future Home Standard. But we MES, we're an energy and sustainability consultancy, so that's where we kind of started out from, really doing everything to do with energy and sustainability. So whether that's, you know, SAPs for a new build, you know, passive house consultancy work, energy and sustainability statements for planning, BREEAM, things like that. Pretty much any aspect of energy and sustainability in building. We also have a side of the business that does daylighting and right to light and other kind of building measured survey work. But that's pretty much what we do. We're part of a wider group called Focus Consultants, hence the part of the focus group in our logo, and they do you know, sort of a much wider range of you know, construction related activities, from funding and regeneration, grant applications, you know, things like that, business planning, up to project management and, you know, QS and building surveying, things like that. So that's who we are. As I say, the BREEAM side of things, this comes out of our energy and sustainability side of things. I'm a licensed, or I was a licensed domestic refurbishment assessor when it comes to BREEAM. So that's where I come at. That's where I come at this from. So what is BREEAM? I'm not going to spend too long on what BREEAM is, because I would imagine that most of you know what BREEAM is. But BREEAM stands for BRE, so Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Methodology. And essentially what BREEAM is a way of assessing the overarching sustainability of a project, development, regeneration, whatever it is. Originally it was kind of intended to be a you know, sort of commercial building related standard, and they produced other schemes. Ecohomes was the first one they did for dwellings, but there are now effectively BREEAM schemes that now cover pretty much every single kind of construction projects that you can imagine, really. So what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a look at, I say, very quick look at what BREEAM is and where it comes from, and we'll then spend kind of the main bit looking at what the changes are, what the rationale behind those changes is, and what the implications that is on projects. So there are some pretty big ones with the changes they've made since 14 and 18. There are some pretty big implications on schemes, really, and in terms of the timing of when things need to happen and when people need to get involved. So, as I say, BREEAM Research Establishment Environmental Method. It's a way of assessing the sustainability of construction projects. It now covers pretty much everything. So the version that we're going to be talking about is the most common BREEAM one that's used, which is called New Construction, which, as you can imagine, is intended to cover new construction. Also used for large large extensions as well. So because that's largely new build, if you're doing a large sort of extension to a building, then that, you know, tends to fall under the new construction side of things. It also covers major refurbishments. So that's through the refurbishment fit out scheme. The BRE in recent years has also acquired SQL. So SQL used to be a standalone thing that was essentially used for assessing infrastructure schemes. So I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that things like the new ticket hall at King's Cross, for example, were assessed. I believe there was a sequel assessment done on that. So it's, it's a fairly common thing in the kind of infrastructure world. That's now been brought under BREEAM as well. So infrastructure is now assessed via through BREEAM/sequel. There's a BREEAM community scheme, and that's basically looking at large scale master planning schemes. So, if you're looking to build, one of these new eco towns that the government's been banging on about for years, again, you could cover, essentially the master planning process of putting that together under a BREEAM community scheme. As I've mentioned, extensions, fit out of existing buildings again. So, if you've got change of use, or somebody's refurbishing an existing commercial building into another type of commercial building, that's where that will be covered. And the in-use performance of buildings. So you can take an existing building, even where no work is being done to it, and assess how well that building or how sustainably that building is being used against a set of BREEAM benchmarks via the BREEAM in-use scheme. Again, if you're doing BREEAM, so BREEAM new buildings, new construction is for commercial, but if you were doing dwellings, you can now assess dwellings via a BREEAM scheme, but it's not called a BREEAM scheme, it's known as the home quality mark. So there is that way of assessing new build dwellings, but it's not, it is a BREEAM scheme, but it's not called a BREEAM scheme, slightly strangely, but that's HQM. You can basically cover pretty much anything with BREEAM new construction, which is what we're mainly going to be talking about, because that's the most common one. Basically covers offices, industrial units, retail, education, healthcare, residential institutions. So whether that's student accommodation is probably the most common one. Community buildings, public buildings, data centres. And then if you've got buildings that don't quite fit into any of those, then there is a bespoke category, which essentially is where they will put a specific set of criteria together that cover that, that scheme basically. So if you've got things that are unusual or out of the ordinary, then they would be covered under the bespoke scheme. It's still the same assessment process, and many of the credits are the same. They just essentially just pick and choose the credits to match the scheme, because some credits are not relevant for some types of commercial building. So they have to put together a bespoke one depending on the scheme. I say it's been around for ages. It says 28 years to 2016. So what does that mean now? We're up to 32, 33. Was first developed in 88. The first kind of the first BREEAM that I ever got involved in was 2008 from memory, which was an officers assessment. I did an officers assessment up in Royal Armouries in Leeds, near the Royal Armouries building in Leeds. That's when I started doing BREEAM. Did Eco Homes and Code before that, but that's when I first started doing BREEAM. Eco Homes finally got replaced in 2012. Got replaced with BREEAM Domestic Refurbishment, or as it's actually called, BREEAM Refurbishment for Domestic Buildings. HQM came out in 2015 when they got rid of the Code for Sustainable Homes a few years before that. And then say the current new construction scheme launched in 2018. There are other schemes in there that aren't covered. So, for example, this doesn't mention when they brought out BREEAM International. So you can now do BREEAM schemes all over the world, and again, different sets of criteria apply. Depending on where you're building and what you're building where. That's out there. But yes, the current version of BREEAM New Construction is 2018. They are currently consulting on a new version, so it wouldn't surprise me if this year, maybe not this year, but maybe next year, we get another version of BREEAM. Yes, they are always working on it and refining it essentially. So the current ones that we're going to talk about in this is the commercial side of things, which is new construction 2018. One of the changes they've made recently is you can actually now go onto the BREEAM website and you can download directly from the website all the different BREEAM manuals. They used to only be available to BREEAM assessors, but you can actually now, anybody can now go on there and download the manuals. They are not the easiest documents to read. You know, they've changed an awful lot since I've been involved. I mean, when I did Eco Homes, to start with, that was something like an 80-90 page document for the whole scheme. I think HQM is now like 400 pages. So it's developed a long way in the time that I've been involved in BREEAM, but it is now good that you can actually, anybody can now get access to the you know, to the manuals and look at all the criteria themselves. So BREEAM is essentially is a say it's an assessment process. It's done by an external assessor. There are 9 categories that get covered. There's a 10th that's called innovation, but that's not a compulsory category essentially. Each category is weighted, so 1 credit in one category is not necessarily the direct equivalent to 1 credit in a different category, which does make some things more important than others in some ways, but that's just the way that it's been done for an awfully long time. It's a 2 or 3 stage process. Generally speaking, you would get a BREEAM assessor to do a pre-assessment at a very early stage in the scheme. So this essentially is where an assessor will look at a scheme as early as possible and, in discussion with the design team, target an initial set of credits to achieve a certain standard. Or alternatively, we'll go through the scheme as it's currently proposed and work out where that is likely to get to, you know, based on what's currently, you know, proposed. That's normally done before planning, so that there is the opportunity, if that pre-assessment indicates the scheme won't reach the level it needs to, or doesn't reach the client's expectations of where they would like the scheme to achieve, then that can feed back into the design process, you know, at an early stage to result in a scheme that is able to achieve the relevant targets before it sort of gets fixed by planning, as it were. Normally then, once a scheme's gone through planning, in conjunction with the detailed design development, the assessor will then do the design stage assessment. In theory, that should be completed before any work starts on site. The DSA is then submitted to the BRE for them to audit it. So essentially, if you are saying, right, we think we're achieving a very good level at design stage, you would submit that to the BRE and they would approve that, and then you would have a bit more certainty that your scheme will actually achieve that. There's then a final stage, which is the post-construction review, and that essentially is designed to check that what was proposed at design stage is what's actually been built and realised on site, which is arguably the most important stage. That obviously then can be done all the way through the construction process if the DSA has been finished before work starts on site. Unfortunately, in my experience, quite often the DSA isn't actually completed before work starts on site. Work starts on site before the DSA has been finished. You can skip that stage completely in that case, and you could just jump straight to the post-construction stage. But that's not, I wouldn't usually consider that to be a good idea, because you're not then getting those design stage credits assessed and fixed early on. Undertaken by registered assessors such as ourselves and our colleagues at Focus, we pretty much cover every single BREEAM scheme that there is, around. So we can assess pretty much any scheme in the UK. And as I say, it's audited. The scheme's developed by the BRE, it's run by the BRE, and it's audited by the BRE. So to get a scheme certified against a relevant BREEAM standard, the assessor assesses it, works out the score, but then they have to submit it to the BRE, and the BRE can call the evidence in as well and audit it. So quite often they will pull the scheme. They will want to see all the evidence for certain credits, and if the evidence doesn't match it up, they'll pull the credit away. So it's why assessors quite often will ask for an awful lot of very detailed information, because if they don't and it's called in for audit, then the BRE will take credits and marks away, essentially. So that's the thing. So what are the big changes from 2014? Well, the biggest change, by far and away the biggest change, is that there are now an awful lot of credits that require professional input at the pre-planning stage. So in the past, if you needed to get, if you wanted to get the ecology credits, or you wanted to get credits for, using materials with a low embodied carbon, for example, you could do that at pretty much any stage of the project. You could wait until after planning. You could then get your ecologist on board to write a report. You could then decide to do a life cycle assessment on the materials and the design of the scheme, what it's made out of, all those different kind of things, and you could still get the credits for those. Now, unless you have that involvement pre-planning, you can no longer get those credits, and that can actually be up to 20 to 25% of the overall percentage score of a development. So obviously, as you can see, that there's a table on the right there that shows the scores that you need to achieve certain levels. And what you can see from that essentially is that unless you actually address those things early on, it's impossible to achieve an outstanding result. If you missed out on 20 to 25% of the overall score and you wanted an excellent, you'd actually have to build an outstanding building and pick up almost every single other credit that's available within BREEAM to get to that level. Similarly, if you wanted to achieve a very good, you would effectively, if you missed out on all those pre-planning credits, you would have to build a building that was actually effectively an excellent level building. So it becomes incredibly costly potentially if you miss out on these early stage schemes, or on these early stage credits. The life cycle assessment one in particular, there's about, I think there's 7 or 8 credits available for doing a life cycle assessment under the materials credits. That assessment actually has to be submitted to the BRE pre-planning. So unless you do it and submit it to the BRE, you cannot get those. It is impossible to get those credits. And that is a big chunk of, credits available. What this is all designed to do, the intention behind all of this is to get this work done early, and therefore to allow it to be fed into the detailed design of the scheme. And if you do that at an early enough stage, then those principles get embedded and the design is developed with those principles in mind. For example, if you're doing, there's no point in doing a life cycle assessment, for example, on the materials, if it's already known and it's already, and if the design's already fixed, we already know it's going to be made out of reinforced concrete, because there's no possible way of building that design without using reinforced concrete, for example. You can do an LCA that might then come out and say, well, actually, if you build it out of CLT panels, you would have a much lower level of embodied carbon within the scheme. You can't do that if then you look at it and go, yeah, but I can't build that design with CLT because it structurally doesn't achieve, you can't do it with the design. So hence they're trying to pull all these things further forward in the design process, so that the work that's done and the involvement in these things will actually get carried through as part of the design. So this is, as I say, it's things like security, for example, ecology, some of the transport credits as well. You have to have this involvement pre-planning. You have to commission professionals to do certain reports and then demonstrate that those reports have fed into the design of the project. That is by far and away that's by far and away the biggest change. And one of the reasons for that being the biggest change is because in the past, essentially the only BREEAM involvement that people would have pre-planning arguably was to do a pre-assessment. So you would do a pre-assessment report, and that would say, well, yes, as part of this scheme development, we are going to target these credits, these credits, these credits, and these credits. And you would then decide whether or not you actually did want to target them or not after planning. Now, if you want to target those credits, you actually have to do an awful lot of the work pre-planning as well and commission reports. That's a really big change. There have been some changes to weightings. That doesn't make that much of a difference. There've been some minor tweaks to the minimum requirements. Again, not that big a change, and they've significantly changed the credit criteria for some of the credits as well. So those are some fairly big changes, but only when it comes to the individual credits. You know, you just have to do slightly different things to gain those credits in those sections. You know, but the biggest kind of macro level change is that early stage side of things. Otherwise, you know, for certain levels of schemes, you can really heavily get caught out. You know, further down the line. You know, if there's a planning requirement, for example, you know, that schemes have to achieve a BREEAM Excellent. If you don't get that early stage involvement, then the council are going to condition excellent as a planning condition, because it's a planning policy requirement. If you then can't get those credits because you didn't, you know, address them early enough on, you know, then that can become a major problem when it comes to, you know, trying to discharge planning conditions and things like that. So yes, this is the thing really. Timing is key, you know, to get the right people on board at the right stage. You know, I suspect people have seen this you know, sort of graph before really, but actually, you know, the earlier on we, you know, address things, the opportunity, we have the biggest opportunity to do whatever we want with the scheme. You know, if we're involved with, you know, when the scheme is literally a blank piece of paper and the architect poised there with a pen going, right, what am I actually going to do here? You know, you've then got the opportunity to say, well, actually, you know, why don't we build it out of CLT? You know, why don't we, you know, incorporate, you know, sustainable drainage? You know, can we move the building, you know, to a slightly different place on the site because there's some ecology that we want to protect on that part of the site over there, for example. You know, that opportunity to make all those changes. You know, and not just from that side as well, but, you know, for things like, you know, view out, can we, you know, can we make sure that everybody in its open plan office is located close enough to an external facade that they have a view out of the building, for example? You know, can we get the floor plans designed in such a way that we can utilize natural ventilation rather than having to have a mechanical system? All those things that we can look at if we're starting from a blank, blank sheet of paper, essentially. The further on we get through the design and construction process, the less opportunity there is to do that. And if we do it in the kind of, you know, traditional place, which is, you know, almost at the crossover between when the detailed design's done or when it, you know, or when the project gets let on a, you know, on a D&B tender, for example, or, you know, as a D&B contract, the ability to make changes to that scheme diminishes, and therefore the cost of making any improvements goes up dramatically because we're now limited on what we can do, and we may have to focus on much more expensive things to do to try and claw back some of that performance that we've either lost or that we've not been able to take advantage of. And that's particularly the case now. You know, if we're losing these large amounts of you know, upfront credits, for example, you know, we might be able to get away, you know, with a building that uses, you know, that uses a little bit more energy because it's more sustainable in its form, in its, you know, construction material, so its embodied carbon is lower. Whereas if we've not been able to address any of that, and actually we get to the point at which we've got to effectively make the building zero carbon in order to claw some performance back, that's going to have a higher, you know, construction cost. So it's trying to balance all these things, but the earlier on that we can deal with these things, and they can get embedded into the design, and we can have an input into what the most cost-effective ways of meeting requirements are, you know, that's an early stage thing. So these are some of the credits here, you know, as I say, and it kind of, you know, maps them against the RIBA stages. You know, so as you can see, there are an awful lot more credits that we have to address, you know, at stages 1, 2, and 3. Once we start getting into, you know, stages 4 and 5, for example, there's a much lower level of credits that we can actually do anything with. Again, just to emphasize the fact that having an early involvement and developing all these things at an early stage is absolutely key to being able to hit levels. Well, it's key to be able to hit the higher levels of BREEAM. It's also key to being able to hit the lower levels of BREEAM in the most cost-effective manner. So I mentioned what the the weightings are. These are the weightings for every category. As you can see, energy is given the highest weighting in terms of the proportion of the assessment that's down to those aspects. Materials is now pretty high as well. That's had a bit of a jump, and so's ecology. So to some extent those will be the sort of, in inverted commas, traditional bits of energy and sustainability appraisal on a scheme. But it's also worth noting that actually taking up 14% of the overall available score on a project is the health and well-being of the occupants of the building. So it's not just necessarily just focused on the environmental cost of the scheme, but it's also looking at that human aspect of sustainability and building or constructing a building that people enjoy and want to use, which should as well maximize the lifespan of that building. And the eagle-eyed of you and those who are quick at mental arithmetic, unlike me who had to get a calculator out to do it, will notice that actually with the 10 categories, 9 including innovation, actually adds up to 110%. And that's because the innovation credits almost kind of fall outside the categories. So the maximum score you can still achieve is actually 100%, but you could drop 10 credits or you could drop 10% of the score somewhere else. And if you achieved all the innovation credits, you'd still be able to achieve 100%. But the innovation bit kind of sits outside the other categories. But the 100% is all the categories added together except innovation. These are the minimum standards, really. So as I say, there are some categories that to achieve certain scores, you have to achieve a level of performance in some areas. So again, you're looking at energy and carbon emissions, for example. For you to achieve an excellent or an outstanding building, you've got to achieve a minimum standard. You can't build a building that uses an awful lot of energy or CO2 and still expect to achieve the higher levels of the scheme. For you to achieve an outstanding score, for example, you've got to deal with the site, with the construction waste management in an exemplary way. You can't just ignore that. You've got to deal with that one issue, for example. Some of these have changed a little bit. Some of them have changed around between which levels they have, but there aren't that many changes over the previous versions. But it is just worth being aware that again, for some you can pick and choose and trade credits to some extent, but there are still these minimum standards that you have to achieve for certain credits. These next 4 slides are a bit complex. I'm not going to spend that long on them, but these are slides that the BRE produced that essentially list all the main changes between 2014 and 2018. Realistically, I've left these in there because if anybody wants to go and actually have a look at these as part of the PDF that we send round, then you can. You'll see that on the right hand side, these sort of areas that are highlighted in this sort of peachy orangey colour, they're the credits which have seen the biggest changes. But it does list for every single one any changes in the number of credits that are available. So if you have a look down at the top, you can actually see if you find Man 5, for example, at the bottom there, aftercare. That's essentially about doing post-occupancy evaluation. And that's seen a bit of a change, actually, because that specific credit, it used to be the case that you essentially just had to make a commitment to undertake post-occupancy evaluation on a project to get the credits. You know, because the scheme gets certified when the building's built, you can't, or you wouldn't usually expect the assessor to check 12 months after they've completed the assessment that work has actually been done. There just had to be, in theory, a contractual commitment to do the work. To get the credit under 2018, you actually have to demonstrate that the funds, the money itself, has been put aside, ring-fenced in a specific location to undertake that POE when that's relevant. So it's not now just about making the commitment. You now have to make a financial commitment to make it even more, you know, hopefully likely that people will actually do the, you know, the POE. You know, I suspect that what's happened is they found that lots of people were saying, "Oh yes, we'll do POE," and they're never actually doing it. So the intention now is that money will be put aside and used for doing the POE when relevant. Yeah, but again, you can now see that under the old 2014, you got 3 credits for doing that. Now it's a maximum of 3, so you can actually get less depending on what you're doing. You know, so again, there's a you know, there's a slight change in the way that things are assessed. Oh yeah, again, if you actually go down a bit further and you look at HEA3, for example, for this specific building that's been taken out, HEA3 has been taken out of this in 2018. It's not there anymore. That's not the case for every building type. I think this is just the example that the BRE have used, but that's been taken out on this specific example, for example. You know, so you can see they do detail exactly how many credits are available. And then again, if you look at HEA6, which is second up from the bottom, you can see that you got 2 credits for this in 2014. You only get 1 for it now in 2018. And they've also changed. We'll have a look at this one in a little bit more detail shortly. But yeah, so this goes on, and this, you know, so this BRE document lists every single credit. So if you want to go through there and trawl through, you can have a look and trawl through basically when you get the PDF. I'm not going to go through it line by line. So yes, oh, there we go. I did say we look at HEA6. So we'll have a look at a couple of specific credits and see what those mean now, and kind of what you kind of have to do. The aim of the security credit essentially is, again, at an early stage, to plan and incorporate into the design measures which give relevant, you know, provision of security to the building or the site, or, you know, the scheme or the master plan or whatever it is. You know, its intention is to get specific security measures identified at an early stage that they can then be, you know, designed into the scheme, you know, to reduce the risk of, you know, crime either to occupants or the property, or, you know, other things like that. The way that this is now done, and as I say, this is now only worth 1 credit. You have to get a suitably qualified security specialist to conduct an assessment of the proposed scheme during or prior to concept design. So we have to do this at stage 2 or earlier, essentially. Again, the intention behind that is that I'm not going to try and say this because there's no vowels in it, but our suitably qualified security specialist, they will essentially come up, they will look at the scheme or what's proposed, and they will come up with a set of, you know, relevant measures that need to be incorporated, whether that is, you know, CCTV, you know, whether it's having, key fob locks on doors, for example, you know, whether it's specific standards of glazing, you know, whether it's saying, well, actually, you know, the access to the store shouldn't be down that, you know, or the access to whatever shouldn't be down the alleyway because that's going to be a, you know, risk to people. It should be put here. You know, if you have to put it down there, you need to do this, and this to mitigate the risk. They will come up with that. They'll put it in a report, and the intention then is that those recommendations, because they're being done basically pre-planning, get incorporated into the scheme, and then because they're incorporated at a pre-planning stage, they will go forward through the lifespan of the detailed design. You know, anything that looks like it's going to change, for example, later on in the scheme, has to go back, and there has to be an evidence trail that's been cleared with our, you know, with our specialist who's developed the scheme or the, you know, the report. we can't just go, oh, that's fine, we've done that report, yeah, we're doing all this at design stage, pre-planning. Then post-planning we go, well, actually no, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that. You can't then do that and then still get the credits, because that will be checked and there won't be that justification or reason that those were a reasonable set of decisions that were made, essentially. The other big one which I mentioned was life cycle assessments. So essentially what this is doing, this is one of the materials credits, and the aim here is to encourage the use of construction materials which have a lower impact on the environment. That might be because they come from a more sustainable source. The specific materials that we're planning on using, they might be transported a shorter distance. They might be made of of materials with a lower embodied carbon. They may be easier to dispose of. If we want to knock the building down in 50, 60, 70, 100 years time, will we can we recycle what the building's made out of, for example? So all these things would feed into an examination of what the building's made out of, and therefore, what the life cycle performance of that building is. So BREEAM sets a methodology for this. It sets performance criteria, and then that can then be assessed against it. This again needs to be done. So that there are quite a few credits available here. There are 6 credits available for the superstructure. There's another credit available for the foundations and any hard landscaping that's done as part of the scheme, and there are another 3 credits available further down the line for doing other things at later stages. So there are a lot of credits involved or available if we do an LCA assessment. This is the one that has the single biggest impact, because we have to do this at concept design, so we're talking stage 2 or earlier, but also it needs to be submitted to the BRE before the scheme goes into planning. If it's not submitted to the BRE before the scheme goes into planning, you cannot get the credits, even if even if you then do an LCA, incorporate every single recommendation from it into the scheme design. If you didn't do that pre-planning, you would not get the credits. The BRE are not the most flexible organisation when it comes to changing things around. So we have had situations where somebody has submitted where someone has submitted a scheme for planning. The planners have then come back and said, "Where's your BREEAM pre-assessment?" We've then gone and tried to do a BREEAM pre-assessment, and they've not got any of these things in place. So even though it hasn't been granted planning, that's not the same as being submitted pre-planning, because the BRE tend to take the data as the date of submission. So we have had situations where people have come back and said, no, you can't have those credits because you've already submitted it for planning. So it really does need to be done, early on, pre-submission, not just pre-consent. It's pre-planning application. Then this then gets developed. So you do this at an early stage. That feeds into the initial design. When it then goes through planning and we start developing it through the technical design process, so stages 3 and 4, you have to keep updating the LCA so that then incorporates the the specific design as it's developed. You need to do various different options as well, because the intention is that this process is constantly encouraging you to question what you're doing and question whether or not there are better ways of constructing the building. It's not just something that you're doing in theory as a tick box exercise to get these 6, 7, however many credits. This is something that should be an integral part of the design process. That's what the BRE are trying to encourage, by saying, well, you've got to do all these appraisals. Their hope is that by doing these 2 to 4 different options, that people will actually go and look at them and go, oh yeah, actually, I know we were contemplating building this building out of reinforced concrete. But actually, yeah, looking at this, the life cycle assessment comes out an awful lot better using a hybrid timber system. Actually, why don't we do that? That's what they're hoping is going to happen, that by putting that information in front of people throughout the entire design process, that it will make people look at it and then think about it, essentially. But as I say, that's what you've got to do. You've then got to do these options, keep refining it throughout the entire design process, and they're hoping that then that will influence the design and make it more sustainable as part of the process. But again, it's another one of these ones where if you miss out on it pre-planning, you're not going to get anything for it at all. Adaptation to climate change. That's the wrong image, isn't it? But anyway, this is again, this is intended to future-proof buildings against more extreme weather that we may encounter as a result of climate change. This is a combination of resilience for the building, so the materials that we construct it out of, the way it's designed, for surviving extreme weather events, but it's also for things like feeding into things like overheating, and whether or not a warmer climate in 10, 15, 20 years time is going to give us overheating issues. We may be able to naturally cool the building now, but can we naturally cool it in 10, 15, 20 years time? If we can't, what can we do to it now so that it can still be naturally cooled down the line, and we're not going to end up having to retrofit energy consuming equipment to cool the building down at a later date, for example. So again, we get one credit available for this. As I say, we're looking at the resilience of the structure, the fabric, how the building services will deal with it going forward. That's from from an overheating perspective more than anything. So we have to conduct an appraisal of the climate change strategy on the building, which includes a risk assessment to look at the impact that changing climate will have on the building. It has to look at all these. It then has to develop recommendations or solutions before or during concept design. So again, pre-planning, we have to have done this work, and this work then has to feed back into the design at the pre-planning stage, so that again, that this work is then more likely to be incorporated within the building. Once we've gone through planning and we get into the technical design stage, we then have to have this report reviewed, the design reviewed against that report to show or to explain why certain things have been included and why certain things haven't been included if we've left them out. So again, there's this process available, but again, it needs to be done at concept design. We can't go back and claim this credit if we've not done this work at a pre-planning stage. So these are, as I say, these are the levels. Again, this is more really just to say, again, if we're looking at 20 to 25% of the credits available, pre-planning, we need to be, we need to be addressing those at an early stage, because if we miss out on 20%, it's going to make it a struggle to get to very good without, having to build an expensive building with an awful lot of kit inside it. If we can address these early on, we can build hopefully actually a better building anyway, because we considered all these issues, and that's the whole point of doing this, is that by doing these at an early stage and feeding them into the design, we will get a better building at the end. But it also means that from a hard-nosed business perspective, the actual building will probably cost us less, because we're not having to target so many credits which are expensive to put into the building. So a little bit of where this kind of maps really into what's going on. As I think we sort of mentioned before, realistically what this actually means is that it stops being a too necessarily staged process, because if you need to know which credits you need to address pre-planning, you need a pre-assessment done pre-planning. So you need an assessor on board to tell you, for the scheme that's being proposed, at an early stage, which credits will it get? Do you need to target any of these ones that need to be assessed early stage? Is it cheaper to do those than it is to do, some other ones? That's information which a good BREEAM assessor will be able to provide as part of a pre-assessment process. So that needs to be done early. It's no good doing that, saying, oh, we're submitting this scheme for planning next week. We haven't got our BREEAM pre-assessment yet. Can you just do us a quick pre-assessment? Again, you're still likely to miss out on all these things because you're not going to have time to do them before the scheme goes in for planning. So really, it's getting an assessor on board at as early stage as possible, will give the best outcome with doing this. That then leads into the design stage. Again, to some extent, if you can kick that off almost before the planning's been granted, almost gives them the greatest time and the greatest levels of information provision to get that evidence together, to get that DSA done, again, ideally prior to construction starting on site. And then we've got that post-construction stage at the end, where essentially we're just trying to check. Hopefully, if we've done everything in the pre and we've covered it all off in the design stage assessment in full, fully documented as part of the design process, in theory it makes the PCSA really easy, because all you have to do then is check that what's been proposed has been done. If you've not got that information in there in the first place, you then have to gather an awful lot more information at post-construction stage. So trying to make sure it's all there up front makes the process run an awful lot smoother. So yes, this is really what we want, is the client's design team, or both, and the BREEAM assessor, and potentially what's known as the accredited professional, if those are credits that we're after, or the sustainability champion potentially. We want to identify what the targets are, work out what needs to be done based on the credits that we know we're going for, what reports and which professionals we need to have in place to produce those reports, and how they need to feed back into the design process, and get them incorporated into the project directory, because they've got a role, they've got a responsibility, and it's all there and agreed and in place. The design stage assessment, again, this is then, I say, can start concept design, usually develops at the post planning stage, but the evidence can be gathered at any point. Essentially, what we're looking at is documented evidence that all these design features are incorporated. So that could be drawings, that could be building specifications. We need to demonstrate that where relevant, we've got the project directory has got the right people in it. It shows people's responsibility, so we know that so that we know that they're in place. That the contractors potentially know what evidence that they need to provide, whether or not if there's going to be things like sideways management plans or management processes in place that the contractors are going to need to implement, that they've got the time and the ability to develop and implement them and document what they're doing. And then at the end of this process, hopefully we will get to the point at which the DSA is completed. We've got all the evidence has been gathered, and it goes off to the BRE for them to effectively QA it and sign that off as having achieved the relevant BREEAM rating based on the design of the building. And then finally, we get on to post-construction, which essentially is where the evidence for this gets gathered essentially from the moment that we start on site all the way to the point at which the building is completed and handed over, really. The in-use bit crops up because if we're going for aftercare credits, we need to make sure that there are certain procedures and management requirements in place. That requirement to do post-occupancy evaluation, for example, it's all that in place. You're not following the building and checking it during the in-use side of things from, as I said, perspective. unless you're doing a BREEAM in use assessment. But you know, it's checking that all the stuff that is meant to be in there to support the use of that building is in place at the point of handover and the point of sign off of the BREEAM assessment. So, you know, evidence for this can be, you know, the assessor going to site, looking around, taking photographs. You know, if part of the credit requirements is that there's going to be, you know, 30 photovoltaic panels on the roof, for example, you can check, you know, the assessor can check that by going to site, maybe going up on the roof if it's safe, but, you know, actually going and taking a photograph. Oh, yes, I can see 30 PV panels. That's fine. They're there. We know we can sign that one off. You know, but it may also take the form of the contractor having to provide evidence about, you know, how much of their waste has been diverted from landfill, you know, things like that. There's a wider range of sort of evidence that, you know, that sort of needs to be gathered. And then again, once all that evidence is gathered, once all that's in place, we can again complete the assessment, submit it off to the BRE, and get the final BREEAM certificate for the scheme. So yes, the absolutely ideal thing really is, you know, the key thing with this is, you know, say start as you mean to go on, try and get everything done as early as possible, you know, get relevant people involved, because that will make things an awful lot easier. You know, it will, it'll get those things into the spec, it gets them into the design, it gets them into the building, and enables those credits to be gained at an early stage, which makes things an awful lot easier going on down the line. So I think that is pretty much 45 minutes actually. It's probably a little bit over, but let's have a look. What have we got? Conversation. Right. Right, so has anybody got any questions? Oh, there's one about sound. That was a shame. I didn't see that one. Sorry.
I think the sound was probably fine, Tom, actually. You were very clear to me all the way through.
Okay, that's all right.
I think it might have just been a problem with an odd individual.
I don't know. I did deliberately upgrade my microphone for this, so I don't know whether that's, you know, I don't know whether it was that, but Passive House. Yes, you can definitely come to us for Passive House. We've got a couple of schemes at the moment that we are you know, acting as the Passive House consultants on at the moment. So yes, certainly that's not a problem. What else we got? How involved are planning authorities to BREEAM standards? If truth be told, outside of the London boroughs and the GLA, not particularly. Actually, BREEAM tends to be a requirement for commercial development within, you know, planning for lots, if not all, of the London boroughs. And then once you start getting onto really big schemes within London, so anything which is referable, for example, you have to do an LCA assessment on any, you know, referable schemes within, you know, for the GLA. So lots of BREEAM, most of our BREEAM work tends to be, because it's a planning requirement for, you know, for London boroughs. Some funding bodies have it as a requirement. So we've got. I think it's a funding. I think the. I think prisons have to be constructed to BREEAM. Certainly, we you know, again we're BREEAM assessors on a you know, prison young offender scheme near Nottingham at the moment, and I think that's a funding / client requirement. But yes, in terms of planning authorities, most of the time it tends to be London. I know our local authorities up here. We're up in sort of Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire. I don't think anybody around here, any of the local authorities around here, have got specific, you know, policies for BREEAM around here. It does tend to be more of a London and a, you know, sort of, you know, metropolitan area thing than it does anywhere else. What else we got? Commercial. Do you mean offices, or does that include residential, sale and letting type developments? Oh, that's an interesting one. I would normally, it relates to when I say commercial buildings, you're normally looking at anything which is obviously commercial. So offices, warehouses, you know, retail developments, anything which is kind of obviously office related. Oh, sorry, you know, commercial related. When it comes to other uses, so you start then getting caught up in what's the definition between a room for a residential purpose and a dwelling, for example. So student accommodation usually would be classed as being commercial, because, you know, you're not, you know, they're normally rented. How that would come in, where if you were doing build to let or not, I don't know, because, you know, if you were doing, you know, build to let flats, for example, that's probably still residential, and you would probably find that would fall under HQM from BREEAM's perspective than it would BREEAM. But again, student accommodation or certain types of care home, you know, where it's a care home, not kind of sheltered accommodation, for example, again, that would probably fall under BREEAM because it's commercial. But you probably, you know, again, if there was a definitive answer needed for that, the best thing to do with that would be to bung it to the BRE and get them to decide. But, you know, if it's a self-contained dwelling, BREEAM would usually look at it as a residential scheme, regardless of kind of what the right, care leavers, 1824-year-old new build dwellings. Oh, you see again, I would have thought if it's a self-contained dwelling, so a dwelling usually is defined as you know, something which can contain a single household. So you've got, you know, bedroom, living area, kitchen, and washing facilities. You normally need to have all of those things. You might combine 3 of them into one room, you know, like a bed sit with an but if it's got a kitchen and, you know, somewhere to wash and somewhere to sleep, that you probably define that as a dwelling. If it's a room for residential purposes, so you've got, you know, like a bedroom with an ensuite, but then you've got 15 of those and one kitchen in a separate space, those are probably rooms for residential purposes rather than individual dwellings. And so if it's a room for residential purposes, it probably is BREEAM. But if it's, you know, if it's you know, if it's self-contained dwellings, then it's probably HQM, if that makes sense. Right. Well, I think I've got the list of everybody who's. I think I've got the list of everybody who's been. So I think he does certainly downloaded it out of Teams. So if anybody's got any other questions, chuck them in. Otherwise, thanks for thanks for attending, and we'll send some CPD certificates and a copy of the slides round.
Thank you very much, Tom.
No worries. I will stop recording and see how I can get this video out to everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.